Hello, welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Today we're going to talk about the Toledo War. The Toledo War. People in this area, I'm referring to Michigan, of course, know what it is, but people outside of the area might not. But I had several people ask me about this, and I've written a book about a guy named Douglas Houghton. Book's called Michigan's Columbus, and in there I have a chapter on the Toledo War, so we can talk about this. If you're not familiar with Michigan, it's made up of two peninsulas. The lower peninsula, which looks like a hand, so people will say, oh, I live here in Detroit or Saginaw or whatever, and they'll point their hand to indicate where they live in the lower peninsula. Above the lower peninsula is the upper peninsula. And for those of you who don't know, that's what the image is on this shirt. Every time I wear this shirt, people comment and say, hey, Steve, love this shirt, or what's with the shirt? That is a diagram or an outline of the upper peninsula of Michigan. And that plays prominently into this story. So back up to before Michigan was a state. Michigan became a state in 1837, but first sought statehood in 1835. And the reason they were doing this is that the Northwest Ordinance had outlined how the Northwest Territory would get turned into states. And so, under those rules, once a distinct regional area, once a distinct area got 60,000 people within its borders, it could apply to Washington to become a state. And you would apply to Congress, and Congress would then vote on whether or not you can become a state. So what happened was Michigan held a constitutional convention, drafted a constitution. They did this in 1835. And for those of you who are trivia freaks, if you look at the state seal of Michigan in Roman numerals across the bottom, it says 1835, not 1837. And most people don't understand that the reason it says that, that's not the year we got statehood. That's the year they held the Constitutional Convention. So in 1835, they held a Constitutional Convention, drafted a Constitution, and submitted it to Washington, D.C. and said, we want Michigan to become a state. Michigan was a territory at the time. They wanted to become a state. Well, there's a problem because Ohio was already a state. Ohio became a state decades before Michigan even thought of statehood. So Ohio was one of the groups in Washington, D.C. that got to vote on whether or not Michigan could become a state. And when Ohio became a state, they'd pulled a little funky maneuver, which some people didn't catch right away. But when the federal government's surveyors surveyed the land that would become Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan, they had drawn a straight line across the bottom of what is basically Michigan today, and they had drawn the line in such a way that it ran below the city of Toledo. And so that meant that if we stuck to that border, Toledo would be in Michigan. And it's funny because, and this is the kind of thing that will cause people to argue to this day, people in Toledo in 1835, many of them considered themselves to be in Michigan. And in fact, you can find postmarks on the internet where postage was mailed to or from Toledo. And when it passed through the Toledo postmaster's office, if it got stamped, it was stamped Toledo, comma, Michigan. Okay? So Toledo was rightfully within Michigan's boundaries. So when Michigan applied for statehood, they applied and said, by the way, we want the boundary drawn by the federal government that would put Toledo in Michigan. The problem, of course, is that the people of Ohio, when they'd applied for statehood, had drawn the map in such a way that put the border above Toledo and put Toledo in Ohio. Now you might wonder, why is everyone fighting over Toledo? Okay, and there's a reason for it, and that is that it's the mouth of a river. And back then, much of what was done with commerce and moving stuff around involved rivers. And also you did things like you set up sawmills near rivers and so on. So rivers were considered to be extremely handy resources, and mouths of rivers onto lakes also very, very handy for shipping and so on. So Ohio wanted Toledo, Michigan wanted Toledo. But the problem is that Ohio, when they had put their paperwork in and had described the boundary going above Toledo, they got in, and apparently nobody objected to Ohio's map, the way that the Ohioans had drawn their map. So when Michigan applied for statehood and said, oh, by the way, we want our border to be down on the other side of Toledo, Ohio just said, no, you can't do that. And here's the problem. Toledo has a vote, or Ohio has a vote on this, but Michigan does not. So when they went to Washington to get statehood, Ohio representatives lobbied other members of Congress to look, you can't vote on Michigan just yet because we have this problem to solve. And so while this little argument broke out, Michigan and Ohio actually thought, wait a second, there's now this disputed strip of land, and it's called the Toledo Strip now. And it was only a couple hundred square miles. But it was back then, men went to war over stuff like this. And believe it or not, Michigan sent its militia members down to the Toledo Strip to defend it. And Ohio sent some of their people up to defend it. And so for a brief period of time, there were actually people in the Toledo Strip agitating over who owns this strip of land. And a bunch of goofy stuff happened where, I believe at one point in time, some Ohioans sent a judge up there and they heard some cases and said, hey, look, we're hearing cases up there. We must have jurisdiction of the area. And then meanwhile, somebody got stabbed in the back on a Friday night in a bar. And there's a debate about that. Was that an act of war, or was that just something that simply happens in Toledo on any given Friday night in a bar? But the haggling went back and forth for quite some time, and it was unclear who was going to win this, because many people said, well, by rights, Michigan is correct. The border they want to use is the border that was set by the federal government. But of course, Ohio, being in Congress and being able to delay votes and stuff, realized that they could deadlock this thing forever. And so after a year and a half or 2 years of this, they finally said, hey, look, we've got a solution here for you. Let Ohio have Toledo. And in exchange for that, we'll give you the upper western two-thirds. We'll give you the two-thirds west of the upper peninsula that right now you don't have. Okay? So the Michigan Territory, which is a part of the UP and all of the lower, would become a state, all of the lower and all of the upper. So you're going to gain two-thirds of the upper peninsula. And so in case you're curious about how that measures out, number-wise, the upper peninsula was more than 15,000 square miles, and the Toledo Strip was 468 square miles. And the funny thing is that at the time, most people in Michigan believed they were ripped off, that they'd been stabbed in the back, much like what happens to you when you go to Toledo on a Friday night, but they'd been stabbed in the back by their own representatives who agreed to this stupid deal. And so it's interesting because the Detroit Free Press, for instance, suggested Congress was wrong to believe the citizens of Michigan can be reconciled to its provisions by extending their jurisdiction over the region of perpetual snows. The Ultima Thule of our national domain in the north. They are much mistaken. And former President John Quincy Adams, who became a representative from Massachusetts later after being president, said Michigan should not have been forced to concede the Toledo Strip. And this is a quote, "Never in the course of my life have I known a controversy of which all the right so clearly on one side and all the power so overwhelmingly on the other." But that's what they settled for. So some people tried to suggest that Douglas Houghton, the guy I wrote the book about, had something to do with making the exchange because he knew what was in the Upper Peninsula. There's actually very little evidence that Houghton was involved in that, but Henry Schoolcraft, who's a friend of Houghton's, actually was involved in it, and he recognized that the Upper Peninsula was more valuable than the small piece of Ohio. And the quote is, "There is no doubt in my mind that the large area of territory in the upper country offered as an equivalent for the disputed boundary with Ohio will be found of far greater value and importance to the state than the 7-mile strip we surrendered." So Schoolcraft went so far as to lobby the Judiciary Committee of the Senate to get this deal to go through. And Schoolcraft knew intimately that there was copper in the Upper Peninsula, and a lot of it. And of course, the copper industry would spring up there and become a huge source of income for the state of Michigan. And so many years later, people would say, yeah, we pulled one over on those people from Ohio. But at the time it happened, the people in Ohio were laughing, going, hey, look, we got Toledo, and you guys got that stuff that's so far up north, most of you will never see it. And that's true, because back in the 1830s, traveling to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan was like trying to go to the moon or something. It was so far away, so difficult to get there. The locks weren't at Sault Ste. Marie yet, so there's no way to take a boat up there. You literally had to take a boat up to basically Mackinac Island, then somehow manage to get yourself up the St. Mary's River, get yourself onto another boat on Lake Superior, and then head across. But there's a couple other things that are important to note, one of which is that when the federal government gave the western two-thirds of the UP to the state of Michigan, the federal government didn't own them. And that's something that many people have overlooked. And I talk quite a bit in my book about how at the time it was customary to find some natives and say, by the way, do you want to sell us your land? And if you do, here's a piece of paper. And our custom among our people is you take this pen and touch this paper, and that means that you're okay with this. And so we would actually swindle the natives out of their land by doing things like that. And so we hadn't yet done that for the western two-thirds of the Upper Peninsula. It wasn't until the Treaty of La Pointe in 1841 that we actually sat down with anybody up there and said, by the way, can we have this land in exchange for whatever it is we're going to give you? Most of which we never actually delivered anyway. But that's another story altogether. So in my book, I'm very, very clear that when I mentioned that, we bought the land from the natives, it was not a contractual exchange like we would expect for most people, but that was common at the time. So I can't stand here and excuse what we did, but that's what happened. I'm a historian. I simply tell you what happened. That's what happened. The other most interesting thing about all of this to me is that it's all very impersonal when you hear about the fact that a bunch of people went off to war and a bunch of other people went off to confront them. And we don't even know if anybody fired any shots in the Toledo War. I mean, we know that the militia went down there and that their militia came up, but did they ever actually shoot at each other? We don't even know. But I do a lot of historical research, and that often takes me to cemeteries. And I often walk around in cemeteries and look at gravestones for a variety of reasons. And occasionally I stumble across stuff I wasn't looking for, but it's interesting nonetheless. And I was walking through a graveyard in Oakland County, Michigan, and there's a certain style of marker that you'll see used to indicate somebody is a veteran of the military. And for instance, I've found War of 1812 military markers in Birmingham. I know there's some Revolutionary War markers over the western end of Oakland County. And I've found some markers of people who served in some of these long ago battles and have a marker because they were a veteran of that particular war. And I was walking through the cemetery and I looked down and I saw this marker, and I'll see if I can find a photograph of it. And it actually says, the man is a veteran of the Toledo War. A veteran of the Toledo War. And it's the only one I've ever seen. And there might be others out there. I've never seen another one. And I was curious to know how unusual that was. I mean, was it just unusual to me? So I actually called around, and I remember speaking to somebody who keeps track of these things at some veterans affair organization. And I asked, and I said, do you have any idea how many markers have been placed for veterans of the Toledo War? And the woman on the phone said, we don't have any records of any. And I said, well, I found one. And she goes, okay, well, it's probably the one. That's it. So it might be he's the only person actually commemorated on his gravestone as having been a veteran of the Toledo War. But I'm sure there's others, but that's the only one I've ever seen. So the Toledo War, probably no shots fired, possibly a knife stabbed in anger, but we're not necessarily sure. But it was actually just a whole bunch of saber rattling as Michigan spent a year and a half, 2 years trying to become a state and then becoming a state. And at the moment, most of the people in Michigan thought they'd been hornswoggled by those people from Ohio. And it wasn't until later years that we actually found out that, no, we actually got the better end of the deal. But of course, people from Toledo might dispute that to this day, and that's their right. Okay? Questions or comments, put them below. Otherwise, talk to you later. Bye-bye.